Okay, hello. I'm Toe Grinder. Um, I'm going to be making a video today on what is hopefully an interesting topic for some of you, and that is why does Frost Mage suck? Why does it suck right now? Why has it sucked in the past, and why it will continue to suck for potentially a while? So if you look at logs for Vault of the Incarnates, obviously logs are not always indicative of what specs are good in progress, but we haven't seen Frost Mage in progress. No one's really playing it at any level of play right now. It's not doing too hot in Vault of the Incarnates. If we look back at Sepulchre, it wasn't doing too hot either. Sanctum of Domination was doing okay. Castle Nathia, it was pretty bad as well. And I could go back and give more examples. But if you're not experienced with this kind of thing and you look at something like Simcraft and you see that Frost Sim's really high, you'd say, oh, well, like its hypothetical ceiling is quite high. Why does it never reach it? And that's like an interesting topic because other than Shadow Priest, I don't think any other spec in the game has seen such a disparity between hypothetical DPS and the DPS that it actually pulls at encounters. Like, it's reasonable to think, okay, this spec Sim's really high. Sim DPS isn't always accurate, so, where would it land? Like, it's not completely meaningless. You'd kind of expect it if it was the third highest in the game that it would land, middle of the pack at worst, but then you look at logs and it's completely terrible. I'm not going to get into Shadow Priest because I think that it's a case-by-case basis on why does a spec see more play than hypothetical DPS would it make it seem, or why does a spec see less play than hypothetical DPS would make it seem. So if we look at the damage profiles of 4 specs that I've taken as an example, right? So the top left, we have Frost Mage. Below that, we have Arcane Mage. And on the right-hand side, I have 2 non-mage specs, which are Outlaw Rogue and Enhancement Shaman. So you can see Frost is damage curve is what we call flat because it's fairly flat. I mean, nothing is completely flat, but if you compare it to something like Arcane, which is very, very up and down, and very bursty, it's pretty flat in comparison. And on the right hand side, I have also shown pick these specs because they're also flat damage specs, right? Obviously, with Bloodlust at the start of a pull, you'll get a lot of damage, but other than that, Outlaw is pretty flat, and so is Enhancement, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So, whenever you get into a boss encounter, you do not get to hit the boss the entire time. That's just how boss encounters work. A very obvious example of this is if there's downtime, right? The boss becomes immune for 30 seconds or flies away or leaves the platform or something. Downtime is quite common. You can say, well, not all bosses have downtime. Yeah, you're right. But if we go back to the last expansion, Stone Legion Generals had downtime, Sardonathrius had downtime, Painsmith had downtime, Sylvanas had downtime. They were the only relevant bosses in those raids. Anduin had downtime. Jailer had a little bit of downtime, not a huge amount, but Razageth has downtime. It happens. So a really obvious example of why this is bad is, let's just say the boss flies away for 30 seconds, like here. So if you compare this between Frost and Arcane and see the hypothetical damage that you would lose in this situation, it is much higher for Frost than it is for Arcane. Right? Simple, because Frost is always doing damage. Now, the first thing you might say is, oh, well, what happens if it happens during Arcane's cooldowns? Because this is an unfair comparison because this is out of cooldowns. Well, if it was to happen while Arcane was bursting, like let's say here, you don't actually lose this damage. What happens is you move this damage. So this gets moved across like this, and this block in the middle is your downtime. So yeah, you've made a concession because you've delayed your cooldown slightly, but the damage hasn't really gone anywhere. If this was like consistently happening, it might be a problem. But for the downtime you see in reality, it's not an issue. You don't really burst specs become relatively better with downtime because they can just burst outside it. And if you have your cooldowns up 20% of the time, but then the boss has a minute of downtime, you actually might have your cooldowns up for 25 or 30% of the time, which means you're gaining DPS where flat damage specs aren't gaining DPS. Which is fine, right? Specs have advantages and disadvantages if a flat damage spec doesn't gain DPS from downtime, that's okay. The spec might have other advantages. The burst spec might have other disadvantages. I picked Outlaw and Enhancement as the examples here because they're two of the best specs in the game right now. If we look at previous tiers, they've both seen play in previous tiers. Warlock was really good in Legion with a flat profile. Like, flat damage specs have seen play. Downtime doesn't always manifest itself in massive blocks. Like, sometimes you just deal with mechanics, right? It might be, yeah, the boss might not fly away for 30 seconds, but you might have to deal with 3 seconds of mechanics 10 times, right? And, you know, that might look something like this. It's like lots of little blocks, but ultimately it's the same thing, right? It's time you're spending not hitting the boss. So hopefully that explains why burst damage specs deal with downtime better than flat damage specs. But Frost's issues go beyond just being a flat damage spec. Like I said, Outlaw, Enhancement, flat damage specs, good. Frost's issues come from Icy Propulsion and Thermal Void. Neither of them are... Icy Propulsion's the bigger culprit, I think, but both of them are to blame. So if I make a green line here for this is your Icy Veins, right? So you cast Icy Veins on pull, then it runs out, and because you have 100% uptime, you cast it again, and it runs, and then it runs out, then you cast it again, and it runs on to the end of the fight, right? Simple. If we add this block of downtime back, let's say it's here, so this is downtime, and like we said, this red line is the hypothetical DPS that you're losing from downtime. An issue is that your Icy Veins no longer looks like this. What really happens is your Icy, if we say this green line at the top is hypothetical Icy Veins and this purple line at the bottom is real Icy Veins. So as soon as you hit this bit of downtime, your Icy Veins will drop pretty quickly after this. Which you would think is fine because, well, whenever you come out of this downtime, you're going to be doing damage where this red line ends. But no, that's not what happens because you lose this bit of Icy Veins here. But in addition, because you weren't getting cooldown reduction, you do not cast Icy Veins at this point. What really happens is you need to make up for this cooldown reduction, and you actually end up casting Icy Veins, let's say here. And let's say the rest of the fight progress is the same. You don't have any more downtime, you get 100% uptime on that Icy Veins, and you know it goes on fine to the end of the fight. But this little block here, where you hypothetically would have Icy Veins, but you lost it because of the downtime, rather than this line just continuing like this, you actively have lost DPS. So let's say this red line goes down like this because you don't have Icy Veins, and then once Icy Veins comes back, you go back up to where you were, right? So normally, a flat damage spec will lose damage from downtime, but then as soon as the downtime's over, it's back to where it was, right? Like if I use the Outlaw example here. But Frost actively loses future DPS from downtime due to Thermal Void and Icy Propulsion. And this is the biggest problem with Frost because downtime and heavy mechanics are just very common in hard raid encounters, and that's just the way the game is. And if Frost is overly dependent on Thermal Void and Icy Propulsion, if those things are tuned well for the spec to do hypothetically good DPS, then that DPS is just not going to manifest in a lot of raid encounters. There's some encounters where it's going to manifest, but it's just not going to be consistent. And the issue is that there's a lot of variance based on difficulty. So on like normal and heroic, like Frost Mage is probably fine, or should be fine. But then on Mythic, it's going to fall off even harder because the amount of time you're punished for movement and just not getting to cast is higher than it would be on lower difficulties. So that means that top players, they're not going to play Frost in the Race to World First unless it's super overtuned. They're not going to play it on streams and people aren't going to see it in keys. Obviously, any spec can be tuned highly, like it happens, but because the difference between Frost's hypothetical, I get to punch the boss all the time, and what actually happens in reality, there's such a big difference between those things that it makes it impossible to tune. Because if you tune it for having lots of downtime, then that means if you reach a fight where you could just punch the boss the whole time, then like Frost just like goes through the roof, right? There's the variance between those two things is too high to balance the spec properly, and it ends up getting balanced in the like conservative end, which means that whenever the game gets hard, the spec sucks. Nobody plays it in Race to World First, nobody plays it on streams, you don't get invited to your keys because nobody sees a Frost Mage. That's just the way it is. So I think that's something I think that at least Icy Propulsion needs to go, and Thermal Void probably needs nerfed, and the spec needs reworked to be slightly less dependent on Icy Propulsion. I think, other than giving ICVians uptime, those things don't like impact the rotation any other way. Like your shatter combos still work. Like you still, like your other spells interact fine without those things. It's just those things cause this massive issue. So hopefully that explains things. I hope this wasn't too rambly, but I kind of just wanted to talk about, oh no, Frost sucks again, and what I think the issues are. I've been quite vocal about these issues in the Mage Discord and in feedback documents I've sent to Blizzard, and just anywhere anyone asks me about Frost, honestly, I've kind of complained about this, but I thought I would make a video kind of just visualizing it and showing it for some people who might not be familiar with what the issue is. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed. I usually don't make content like this, but if people are interested in more not gameplay content, certainly let me know. And yeah, subscribe and check out my other videos. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.